back. I am one of those Layman Pascals you've heard about. This is the integral stage series in conversation with people who seemingly can't stop themselves from communicating about transformative, integrative, and emergent multidimensional themes through podcasts, YouTube videos, and other online formats. Who are these people? What do they point towards? And how can we help connect them, clarify them, and amplify them if, that is, they actually do comprise a them of some kind? Here to help us explore this terrain today is Daniel Thorson, who for some reason I always use the full name of. Daniel Thorson, get us started by telling people where they can find your online content.
Sure. My podcast that I host is called Emerge, and you can find it, probably the best place to find it is on www.whatisemerging.com/podcast.
That's very interesting, Daniel Thorson.
Thank you, Layman Pascal.
How do you frame your work? What do you think it accomplishes, and what would you love for it to accomplish?
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, typically the only framing of my work that seems sustainable is that I'm having conversations with people that I find fascinating, that I'm curious about, and increasingly that I experience some kind of like erotic pull towards, not sexual, but just sort of like I want to get to know what it is that how they see the world. And as soon as I put any kind of like loftier vision of what it is that I'm doing, I notice that the excitement for myself around the project starts to dry up. So I try to keep it pretty simple like that. And in terms of what I hope it accomplishes, I mean, my dream would be that folks listen to it and like have a sense of taking greater responsibility for their life.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Since you have an obvious spiritual or religious orientation, do you think of these conversations when they work well as being a kind of extended Sangha?
For me, certainly. Yeah, I mean, the network that I found myself embedded in since I've started the Emerge project is profound. And you know, I just came out of a 75-day retreat. And it was interesting because on the one hand, I came out into my physical community here at the Monastic Academy. I was kind of received, and I got to sort of reintegrate into that whole. And at the same time, I started to kind of enter back into this online new sphere, this global or planetary Sangha that I found myself now to be a part of. And so it's been very interesting to have those two re-entries happen side by side. So it certainly functions as a kind of extended Sangha for me. I don't know to what degree it does for others. You know, the unfortunate fact is that podcasting is a broadcast medium, and Sangha, for me, I think has to be two-way or you know, omnidirectional to really be Sangha. So
I find something like that in myself, which is why I ask. You know, I'm split between, on the one hand, thinking of Dharma in its broadest sense as being an existing body of wisdom to learn and receive, and on the other hand, a set of conversational skills that allows wisdom to be regenerated within any cultural or historical context, as long as the right conversations are going on.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I love that. One of my teachers, Rob Brabea, who just recently passed away, talks about this simultaneity of creating and discovering, right? So we're constantly creating and discovering. They're not actually separate. We don't have a word really that means both of those things at once. So we have to say create and discover. And that for me is very much a part of, call it a religious movement, but what this is all about for me.
Why call it Emerge?
Well, the honest answer is that I used to work for a company called Buddhist Geeks, which was like a kind of OG podcasting media company. And my friend, Vince Horn, who started it, I was with him as he explored the limits of Buddhism as a container for his inquiry, and ran up against the limits of that and started to kind of almost resent Buddhism, even though when he started it, he loved Buddhism. I mean, it was the love of his life. And so I very conspicuously and intentionally picked a kind of container or a title or a framing that would never feel constraining. And so emerge is this kind of sense of like, oh, there's always something new. There's always some new way of seeing. There's always some new way of being in relationship to life or to the world or to others that I can explore and that's calling me forward. There's always some new complexities and new nuance. And I don't know where that's going to come from. You know, it might come from sociology. It might come from primitive skills. It might come from philosophy. It might come from theology. It might come from technology. It might come from some emerging discipline that I don't even know about yet. And I want to be free to explore them all.
Nice. Very open.
Yeah.
There's a lot of philosophies around emergence as sort of the leading edge of the development of the universe, but there's also this sense in which emerging is the alternative to asserting something, where if you just sort of inspect what's there and see what you can find in it, then what emerges is something more pure, more embodied, richer than if you just made an assertion. And I think I heard you say somewhere that you sort of have an allergy to totalizing narratives, which makes me think of you know, working in a medium where you're open to organic richness and deviance and complexity and plurality in the conversation. What I wonder is, has that always been an attitude you've had, or is that a kind of the result of some insights that you've developed over time?
It's a result of insights I've had over time. I used to be a very totalizing, kind of in my own way, fundamentalist sort of personality. I was kind of known for it, actually. I was a first-ranked member of the debate team in my college, and I would kind of intellectually humiliate people through my kind of like almost, looking back, kind of authoritarian perspective taking. And I was very good at that, and I actually got rewarded for it. And I was, you know, I kind of loved it because it validated some kind of intellectual identity I had. But I think really once I started meditating in earnest and developed a better theory of mind and kind of really contemplated how I want to be alive, then that quickly fell away. It became obvious that taking a totalizing perspective or reducing the way things are into any single narrative or conceptual vision is just a kind of violence on life that not only isn't true, but for me, more importantly, just destroys beauty and aliveness, which are, to a large degree, what I want to amplify in everything I do.
Nice. What do you think are the skills required to have a good conversation?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. My first impulse is to just put it back on you and ask you where you're coming from with that. I mean, there's how dialogical is this meant to be? I would like to know.
Well, we could go as far as you like in either direction.
Okay.
If you want to go back and forth, I'm fine with that.
To really answer that question, I would have to know what you mean by good conversation. Like what's in that for you? What's wrapped up in that?
Yeah, so I would kind of think of it in two senses. On the one hand, like a colloquial sense of a good conversation, where when you're done, you feel richer, you feel more energized, you feel like you didn't waste your time in predictable modes. Nobody was sucked anybody else's energy or sabotaged it, and it got somewhere you didn't expect. But on the other hand, you know, Plato talks with Socrates. There's a sense that a conversation can sometimes get you to a place that is transcendental, where it's equivalent or even exceeds sometimes your own personal practice. So both of those is what I mean. Either of them.
Yeah. And I would add a third too. Sometimes a good conversation completely destroys you. Like it precipitates an existential crisis. Right. And I think that's one that I'm longing to get better at personally. But so if I consider those three, well, I don't know. I mean, this is an ongoing and open inquiry for me. And to a large degree, it's why I started the podcast, was to learn better how to have good conversations, at least of a certain variety. Good intellectual conversations, I think, that felt grounded and embodied. I'll say that for the purposes of my podcast, I know that I'm having a good conversation because my energy body is progressively harmonized over the course of the dialogue, whereby by the end, I'm basically a hair's breadth away from a state of samadhi or concentration. Like I could sit down and everything would just be flowing. And I think part of the reason that that happens is that, and part of what constitutes a good conversation is that I'm constantly speaking on behalf of that which seems most meaningful and relevant to the discursive or the dialogical space. And so to the degree that you don't do that, or I don't do that, that seems to kind of ossify my energy, and then the conversation doesn't feel as good. And whatever is meant to be said in that shared space doesn't get said, and you can kind of feel it in the field, and that doesn't feel good.
Right. So you're navigating by feeling and trying to serve the context, and
Totally
remembering the opening that's available for what this conversation is supposed to become, like leaving that space for it.
Totally. Yeah. And I think the most important thing is that I do what I can to try not to get too much in my head, which is interesting, I think, because people listen to the podcast, the conversations I have on my podcast, and it seems very heady. And a lot of people tell me they can't listen to it because it's like too intellectual. But the actual experience for me of participating in the conversations is one of deep embodiment, typically, where I'm actually just like feeling my way. Like I will feel like I don't understand something, and I'll be like, oh, what don't I understand? And my body will tell me I don't understand something, and then the words will come into my head, and then I'll speak them. But it comes from the body. It doesn't come from like the head out my mouth. It comes I think it comes from my body up into my head and out my mouth. And as soon as I make it like head to mouth, just head to mouth, the conversation gets real flat, I feel, and boring. And
it's interesting to me when a very embodied conversation is perceived by someone else to be too heady. And it often sometimes it tells you more about the listener than about the speaker.
Totally.
Like I remember hearing a poet say that he became a poet because he didn't have enough imagination to do mathematics. Right. So it's this kind of thing, like if you're going at ideas with heart and body, then you can take heart and body up into these amazing idea realms. But if someone else isn't doing that, they just hear amazing idea realms and kind of gap out.
Totally. I know. Yeah, I got like chills all over my body. And this is something that I am so alive with, is that ideas can be this erotic landscape of embodied experience. But so many people, especially in the spiritual circles of the modern West, I think, tend to just be like, concepts are anti-spiritual, anti-body. And if you're dealing in that kind of world, then you're like not practicing, or that's not what this is all about. That's a problem. Get away from concepts. And that's been one of the kind of baselines of my podcast, is basically trying to disrupt that, I think, really naive perspective on concepts. The problem is that typically the way you disrupt that is through concepts, and the people that are really holding to that perspective, I suspect, don't really encounter these very persuasive, in my opinion, and well thought through lines of arguments. But it's to their own detriment, because honestly, like the landscape of beauty that conceptuality opens up is enormous. I mean, and it's such a tragedy, I think, that so many people in the spiritual world have a concept that tells them that concepts are not relevant to spirituality. It's very sad to me.
Yeah, there's self-sabotage at every level is a possibility.
Yeah.
You were talking about wanting to get into conversations that precipitate a crisis and maybe destroy you. Now, were you thinking more in terms of your skill of destroying someone in a conversation, or were you hoping to get destroyed?
I would love to be destroyed. I mean, both. I think that's really what I had a conversation with Andrew Taggart on my podcast, one of the last conversations I recorded, and we talked about this. But essentially, there's a way, I think, of speaking to each other that doesn't let your conversational partner turn away from the truth and integrity of their heart. And often, if somebody like kind of just holds your face in it for long enough, you'll often break open to new understandings of how your life, how you've been living out of integrity with what you know to be true. And I love it when that happens. I mean, part of me hates it. Part of me does not want to do that, but I'm always appreciative from a longer term perspective when somebody does that. And I'd like to get better at that myself, of supporting people and not looking away from their integrity. Yeah.
It's a fine line, because there are, it seems like a lot of people who, their ego prides themselves on their ability to interfere with others for the sake of what they think is the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, that's exactly what makes it such a, artful process, right? Because if you do that, then that's just more bullshit.
There's a thing, obviously Zen history is full of these fragments of conversations that were thought to have facilitated, made non-duality visceral and contagious, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
What have you noticed about conversations that you've been in your life where in the conversation you felt like some other transmission came across to you?
Well, one place where that happens quite often for me is here at the Monastic Academy in the interview room, when I'm working with the teacher here, Soryu For All. And he would be a great person to have on some kind of podcast to ask that question to. He comes from a Zen background. And more generally, it seems to be the case that happens to the degree that both parties are holding this stance of being more or less unwilling to look away from what is true. Now, true is a very difficult word to use with a straight face, but there's a sense that both parties are really, I mean, I think it probably better to put it in the negative, are unwilling to bullshit each other. Yeah, and then something can sometimes arise there, is my experience. But man, if I could make it happen more often, I would love to know exactly how that meat gets made. I don't know, what do you think? I now you got me curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I look at that Zen history, there's obviously a peculiar style of phrasing that they're using. The people have to have the degree of being that enables that to happen. But there's something about that, we call it paradoxical or whatever, but there's something about putting focus on something where there's no room to move, and also suspecting that all the answers might be in that trap. And also, I think, shifting context. If you read all those Zen parable cases, very often the next person who speaks comes at it from a completely different angle, and then they get hit by another angle. So this kind of radical perspective shifting. I was going to ask about that because I wonder about the degree to which moving among different types of truths facilitates the harmonized experience and the higher possibilities of discourse. Like if a person is bringing sensations and feeling and ideas, or moving back and forth between spiritual and material, or whatever the domains are, but moving among domains might facilitate it.
Yep, I think so. I think so. I mean, that is fundamental to my, spirituality, I suppose, is really playing with different ways of looking or different ways of relating to whatever it is, right? But understanding that the way of looking itself, the object, whatever it is, the idea, the situation, arises dependently with how you look at it. And so by kind of like shifting perspectives or shifting ways of looking, shifting ways of relating, we actually give rise, I think, to a richer thing, whatever it is that we're playing with, right? And so in terms of building a rich conversation, yeah, it's indispensable. If you're locked into one perspective, I mean, I hope it's a good one.
Yeah, I don't have a question about this, but I just wanted to bring it up because it's something that's always at the edge of my thinking about conversations, which is a moment or a degree to which that richness that's been built up or discovered starts to become a player, as if it was a third participant in the conversation. And whether I have a responsibility to sort of shift into a relationship to that once it's there.
That's great. Yeah, I find it very useful to bring to presence that personally. How do you usually work with that question or that tension?
Well, it's true. I'm not satisfied with the degree to which I work with it, because usually it's clear to me in retrospect after the conversation. I think, oh, it was definitely there. I'm walk away with it afterwards, but I think, what could I have done in the speech other than be peripherally aware of it? You know, call it out, mention it. Is that enough? What would the next step be?
Yeah. My sense is that it's a really powerful move if you're attempting to kind of create this third, almost like dialogical entity among the participants. Because what I notice is that if I'm feeling it, if I'm sensing it, and then I name it, the other participants can also then name it, sense it, and we can actually develop some more coherence around the naming of it. And that, if we're all co-sensing it, then that is typically what takes the whole thing to another octave. Usually away from a little bit, it dampens though my experience, it dampens our individual like agency perspective a little bit though. It tends to start amplifying this. It tends towards more like unity consciousness and things like that, which is great and lovely. But you know, you have choices to make, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm always concerned about the what the relationship is between the structural capacity of a relationship or a group of people and versus their ability to get into higher mutual harmonies with each other. Because I've seen a lot of groups get to a place that is amazing in their intersubjective communion, but then I've seen it not necessarily become anything in any of their lives. And I know that there's a lot of groups that can function together in very intelligent ways that don't necessarily get that experience with each other.
Yeah. What do you make of that discrepancy?
I sort of have to just imagine they're two different epistemological domains with their own sets of practices and procedures. But in my heart, I feel like there's a better interface. And I feel like there's probably a way of holding and questioning the emergent mutual field in such a way that it would be predisposed to become structured and embodied more.
So you're saying that there's some way of holding those kind of like peak experiences that would help it to embody into the life beyond that peak experience. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And
it's almost like being obstructed. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, you know, it's interesting. We're kind of running an experiment here where I live at the Monastic Academy, because we do circling retreats and circling practice. Are you familiar with circling as a?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's a kind of intersubjective conversational meditation style, and you know, we do week-long retreats where all we do is circle together, and we definitely reach states of kind of collective coherence that are peak experiences and outside the norm of what we experience, you know, week to week, day to day. But then we immediately go back into our work life, our practice life together here at the center. And what I notice is that it definitely impacts the kind of the kind of like psychic social infrastructure of trust and love and patience and willingness to do things that you don't want to do for the sake of the whole, and all the things that make a community like this actually flourish. And I wonder the degree to which what you notice about how these peak experiences don't necessarily then land in the world, so to speak, is due to the fact that so many people do that kind of work in drop-in groups, right? Where they're just kind of encountering each other for a brief period of time, for a weekend or a week. And then they kind of, my experience is you then try to like make it work using online communications, or maybe you even do like a semi-regular group if you all live in the same place. But that is not the same as living together in a community where you're, just have to make it work because there's no escape. And so I haven't noticed as much of a discrepancy here, the one that you referred to, probably though because of the kind of, the structure and the schedule and the fact we all live together.
Yeah, that's interesting. That could make a big difference, I think. To me, this question is a bit of an analogy to the question of personal experiences and assimilation of those experiences. I live in horror of getting to the end of my life and all the peaks, all the insights, they all just were for a moment and fell away, and I never kept any. Now, part of me likes the surrender and release, but another part of me thinks my job is not to get into epiphanies. My job is to bring something back from epiphanies.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. I mean, that's real tough. I mean, that's the teacher here at Monastic Academy says that's really the rub of the spiritual path to a large degree is letting go of your insights without forgetting them. I struggle with that pretty much every day. I'm not very good at it.
Yeah, it's like breathing. I mean, something comes in and then you let it go back out, but you hope you got something in addition to what you released.
Yeah, but it's so easy to have an insight and then it just completely evaporates and doesn't leave a mark on your life.
Yeah,
I've had it happen to myself many, many times, and then I almost have to have that insight again. And I was, and I know lots of people. I mean, lots of people that come here have insights, and then it's like nothing happened. But something did happen, but nothing happened really.
There's a beautiful, tragic moment where you have an epiphany, and you're like, oh, and you realize you've had that epiphany before. And so what happened to it?
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean, though, with the good conversations. I mean, that to me, a form of good conversation is the kind of conversation where we hold each other accountable to our realizations, right? That like, you part of the way that we don't forget our insights is through accountability and through community and through naming it amongst people that we want the respect of, things like that. And so, that's a big part of where I think like my solitary practice kind of grounds into my life and community.
I think the social aspect is definitely one of the features that helps the anchoring process, for sure.
Totally.
What about your family? Do you have good family conversations? What's your childhood background in conversation?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'll say, my family, nobody in my family is interested in these topics. Like I had my mom, who's like an incredibly intelligent woman, professor. Everybody in my family is a professor, both my sisters and both my parents. And I had my mom, she listened to one of my podcast episodes and it just did not get anything. She was like, this all sounds like nonsense to me, basically, but I'm happy that you enjoy these conversations. And so the kind of content wise, there's not much symmetry of interest, I guess you could say. But I think certainly I grew up, given that my parents were both professors, they would often talk about ideas at the dinner table. And so there was this kind of like just love of concepts, I think, that was implanted in me from a very young age, that I've struggled with, because like spiritual people, quote unquote, aren't all wrong. Like obviously concepts are a problem if they're held incorrectly. But I also, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so that was definitely a big part of my childhood. And it's probably a large degree to why I can kind of swim in these multi-perspectival waters the way I can.
Spiritual people aren't all wrong, says Daniel Thorson.
Oh, God. When you say it like that, oh, geez.
That's right. He'll have one of those things at the bottom of the screen where it quotes you.
Yeah. I'm willing to go to battle with that one, actually. It's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
In terms of producing material online, who do you like? Who do you admire? Who do you think's got good content, or who do you think's got the aesthetics and the setup that you like? Who do you look to? Who do you listen to?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like professionalism, obviously Rebel Wisdom is just killing it. I've learned a lot from talking with David and kind of seeing just how they manage to make everything look so professional. In terms of where the center of gravity in the conversational space is, I mean, I just got out of a 75-day silent solo retreat, so you know, I'm not totally on the cutting edge, but it seems like Peter Lindbergh, with what he's doing with the Stoa, has really pushed the whole field forward, is the sense that I get. And in general, I love his approach to conversations and his attitude. I think that it's right on the money as far as I'm concerned. I do, though, think that in general, how can I say this in a way that's not annoying? I wish people in our neck of the woods were a little bit more earnest in our media ecology. You know, I tend to.
What do you mean
I think,
by earnest?
I would like to wear my heart on my sleeve. Like this is all about being of service to the world, to sentient beings. That's Buddhist parlance, but like coming out of retreat, I feel like, why are we having some of these conversations? I think for me, if it's not about either becoming more able to be of service or of directly serving the world, then what is this? And maybe this is a way of saying, you know, in metamodern terms, there's the irony and sincerity kind of like oscillation. I wonder if if we haven't yet found our way to a real grounded sincerity that we can trust, and I wonder where that will come from, and how we can rely on that and take that seriously and be willing to kind of like have these conversations with our heart open, maybe, and yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I do think the sincerity side lags a little on the sincere irony. Part of that is probably because of just the long history of pre-modern especially, but pre-modern and modern forms of sincerity. So like it's hard to be ironic in terms of flexible and meta and, you know, maybe even post-metaphysical things like that. To do that and really feel like you're taking things seriously when everybody who ever took anything seriously was doing it with these huge totalizing assertions.
Yeah. Well, so what's your take on how you discover a kind of I love that term, post-metaphysical sincerity. Like what's all wrapped up in that?
I think there's probably two things, and one of them is just the emotional components. If you're better with your emotions, or if you skew conversations, like I think asking people what they hope is a good way to get to earnestness. But another part of it is a kind of foreground background flip, where we've tended to think there's viewpoints, and then there's some kind of space between the viewpoints that maybe we tolerate and maybe we don't. But if we thought of the space between the viewpoints, if we thought of the interperspectival space as the real solid ground, not the mysterious area in between, that's what we can build on. It's solid. We can have confidence in that. We can go forward in that. We can tell each other that we can have all the profundity of the past and maybe more from that space of not having to believe and insist.
Yeah, that resonates. Yeah, there's some kind of like I think that's the trick, is there's some kind of sincerity in emptiness. There's some kind of sincerity in the theater-like nature of the whole thing that I hope we all can tune into, because I think it's actually really an important part of these conversations having a potency. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hugely important to me, but I'm seldom in discussions where it makes sense to bring it forward. Like very often it's such a arcane or contentious topic that you get derailed into weird considerations, that's not a bad thing to do, but it only seems like it's a space where somebody who already basically gets it can talk to somebody else who already basically gets it, and that's where you go, yeah, we're both right here. This is really something. We can work with this. It's a presence, not just an absence.
I'm not sure I understand, like, where how does it get derailed typically, or what's the, can you say more about that?
Here's the thing. I was the guest on a philosophy salon a few days ago. Right? And they wanted me to talk about post-metaphysical spirituality. I actually wanted to get into my theory of the dynamics of spirituality, but we never got there because the idea of spiritual experience and practice versus belief was such an interesting concept that everybody wanted to weigh in and wonder about it, and they hadn't heard it that way before. Some people just went at it as aggressively, like, how can you say that? The whole point of spiritual traditions is that belief is what works. There's just a lot of issues for people, and also it's a very new concept for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I don't mean negatively derailing, but there's a lot of prep work.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, oh boy. So within one of the approaches to spiritual practice that I do is kind of a emerging spiritual approach called the soul-making Dharma, created by Rob Rebea. They talk about what they call it, themenos or temenos, which is a kind of spiritual container where you can actually have these deep experiences of sincerity and beauty and divinity and sacredness with other participants. But in order to create that container, you actually need a whole list of prerequisites, everything from emotional sensitivity and kind of capacity and energy body sensitivity, all the way to ontological symmetry, right? You need actual epistemological coherence in order to have these experiences and have them be held in a way that allows them to flourish and not be taken advantage of or derailed, as you say. And so I hear you. There's like a lot that goes into having the kind of experiences that I long for, and that I hope that they can somehow find their way into media. For me, I'm interested in that. Yeah.
That sense of energy sensitivity, of a somatic, generalized somatic interoception, or whatever we might want to call it. To me, that's huge. To me, that's a very root practice for establishing a container that works and takes me forward.
Totally.
I did a whole series of interviews with people on spiritual transmission, and most of them sort of ignored my questions about that and felt like, the higher consciousness is given by grace and it doesn't have any specific requirements. And some people have that somatic sensing and some people don't. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to ponder that. But in my experience, you don't get very far.
Yeah.
Or if you don't have that and you go forward with only part of yourself.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I don't know if you noticed my slight kind of like, I felt taken aback that people would argue that you can, I mean, that's just so not inconsistent with my experience. It's all about this energy body, this body of energy, this body of the soma is where this all goes down. I mean, but then again, varieties of human experience, who knows? Maybe there's other ways to go about it. But I don't think so. I feel pretty confident about that. If I'm gonna hang my hat somewhere, I feel that's a pretty defensible place to hang it.
What about politics? What do you think are the social analogies to all these processes and ideas?
The social, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Like, how about this? What kind of political and socioeconomic setup in society do you think best supports interpersonal and individual development and practice?
Oh my God, Layman, that's
Yeah.
a big question.
Answer in 30 seconds.
Right, right. Let me just let that drop in and see what wants to come out.
So here's, if I give it a little more framing for you, it might help. I don't know.
Sure.
But
sure.
like, here's,
Yeah, please.
you could make a conservative argument and say that people who want to preserve traditional lifestyles and traditional values are keeping up the context in which our ancestors have always done their development of meaning and their spiritual transformation. And that you've got to have, church-like structures, you've got to have strong social codes, you've got to have like smaller communities, you've got to have, the divine called out in the political system. You got to be wary about new innovations because they don't necessarily tap into that ancient, genetic, mythological, spiritual history that's manifested in traditional customs. There's the conservative argument. The progressive argument is what you need is more generalized and distributed well-being. If you want somatic activation, you need everybody to have more secure and healthy bodies. They've got to eat right. They've got to have medical insurance that they don't have to stress about all the time. You got to take some of the basic problems off the table so people can flourish.
Yeah. Well, I'm much more personally sympathetic to the liberal argument that you just stated. I would say for my piece, to say something that perhaps isn't as commonly said in these kinds of arenas is that I think one of the things that is might help this along is if we start revivifying concepts like the soul and like God and the sacred and finding ways to hold them in this ironic sincerity such that they can have power again, so that nature can be sacred, so that life can be sacred, so that beauty can be sacred, and that as we empower those and kind of find our desire to live in a way that creates a beautiful soul, then I think that the social systems it'll start to become clearer which social systems and social contexts are anathema to the soul. Like if you walk into a modern hospital with the perspective of what amplifies and what dampens the soul, it's a terrible place to be. It's a terrible place to be, even though death is right there next to the soul. It's very confusing. And you could imagine reconstituting or just even making all kinds of shifts to a hospital to make it a little bit more soulful. And for me, that would feel like it's just an interesting way into thinking about what you brought up.
Mm. It's just making me think of the last time I was in a hospital, which was my father was in a coma around Christmas. He's with my brother in Indonesia now, so his recovery's been terrific. But he was dead-ish. But it's interesting to be in those hospital room spaces and to see what your actual options are for creating a change in mood and vivification there.
Yeah. Not much.
Not much. A little bit. I mean, most people do nothing. So you can bring in color, you can bring in sound, you can bring in love, but the structure itself places a lot of inhibitions on that.
Yeah. And so just making room for soul, both in our own minds and hearts, but also like in conversation and in systems when we can. I think that's a big part, or it's a big part for me. It's a big part of where I think passion is moving.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because there may be other dynamics in other zones. It's a big part for me too, but sometimes I wonder if that's just my specialization, and then how would you rewrite the rules of a legislature to make its outputs more soulful, regardless of the mood of the people who were involved? I don't know.
Yeah, totally. And I would not at all suggest that this is like a kind of totalizing narrative, right? It's not all about soul, but for me, I think it's a leverage point that I'm keen to get more familiar with, because partly because I grew up as a non-religious and spent a lot of time as an atheist, and so even the idea of looking in this way is quite new to me, and is very rich and opening a lot of beauty and meaningfulness in my life. And so I think it's mostly a reflection of where I'm at personally, not that it's a panacea by any means.
The spiritual religious life is interesting to me. I've always been skeptical and obsessed with it. And at this point, I'm kind of agnostic about whether anything's really there. I actually don't care whether there's any prior realities that I'm dealing with. It would work fine, but it also works fine if there isn't, because there's a very easy model in which the integration of different parts of myself builds up into a surplus resonance that I can then relate to in some fashion as a higher self, a higher other, a higher energy, or whatever. And by integrating me, it produces a wholeness that is equivalent of my soul. And I can also see there's a social analogy where if people come together and different genres of culture come together, they get a similar effect, and they call it religion. They divinize something about their culture. Right? And that works perfectly fine with no pre-existing ontological necessities. Now, they may or may not be there. That's a different discussion, right? There doesn't have to be a God for me to experience God, but I've experienced God, and it looked like he was really there.
Yeah, well, it also looks like these trees outside my window are really there, but they're not. They're empty, and any God that exists is empty too. So is the soul. So I am not. I guess, see, this is why you create containers in which there's ontological clarity. When I talk about soul, when I use that word, I do not mean a self-existing entity. There's none of that to be found, as far as I'm aware, anywhere. But we can still, just like all these other non-self-existing entities that impact us deeply, we can still play with these ideas and hold them in ways that impact us deeply and open up landscapes of meaningfulness and beauty and soul, even though that isn't a thing, apparently. It doesn't seem to be a thing. I can be, agnostic about whether that's a thing, at the very least.
Yeah, that agnosticism.
Neither real nor not real.
They
say in Buddhism, they say the middle path is neither real nor not real. That's the razor's edge. And I mean, that opens up into a very broad highway of experimentation and play, I think, if you walk it carefully. So
that kind of middle path approach, Nagarjuna's turning of the wheel. It's really profound. It's the grandfather of Zen. The thing I like, I've heard people try to analyze Nagarjuna's form of logic compared to Aristotle's form of logic, and I feel like they're missing the point.
Fascinating.
I feel like what he's doing is taking his feeling attention back and forth over a distinction until that distinction transcendentally blurs out. And I see that the descendant of that kind of cognitive approach in the Zen tradition, where you do go back and forth across a distinction, where it almost seems impossible that these two things could coincide, but as you keep going back and forth, something happens to you.
I love that. Yeah. That seems true, or a useful way of looking at it. Yeah.
All right. Well, podcast again. What would you do? What would you love to do? Like, what if your resources to make online content were suddenly doubled, or something like that? Like, what would be the next step for you?
Suddenly doubled would not actually be that much of an increase, because the number is so low right now. But
suddenly I was making
some number that would. We'll imagine a number that actually provides some extra possibilities.
A significant number of some kind.
I would love to travel to different emerging experimental neo-monastic communities and make like a video series about what I find there, and kind of try to weave a network between those spaces, particularly like people that are experimenting with ecologies of practice in a really deliberate way, like we are here at the Monastic Academy. My sense is that we're at the very beginning of a planetary renaissance when it comes to those sorts of spaces. And I would love to open up pathways of learning between those nodes. Jim Rutt refers to them as kind of like proto-B communities, proto-game B communities. And I sometimes dream about, somehow moving from community to community, learning and sharing best practices between all of them. And that would be wonderful. But besides that, I mean, the nice thing about what I do is it's very low cost. So I don't know that I'd want to make it much bigger in any way.
Yeah, it would be nice to travel into different contexts with it. I go to visit my mother in Puerto Rico, and her husband was in a Gurdjieffian group that lived in the tropics for years.
Cool.
They were part of the people that put the Biosphere Project together back in the day.
Right on.
The people who were in the community and who've left, they stay in touch, but they're like post-community. They've all got reflections on it now, and they've balanced it with other parts of their lives. Those people really intrigue me. When they get together for dinner, say, I would love to be able to record and orchestrate that dinner a little bit. The people who've blossomed out of the specific context they were in, but still bring all that stuff with them.
What intrigues you about that perspective or that?
Here's what I love about it. I'm fascinated by the dynamics of the communities. I'm fascinated by the practices and their effectiveness. I'm concerned about the limitations of groupthink, in particular languaging. And I'm very interested in how specific bodies of teaching and practice rub up against the complexity of the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
So the people who've come out of the context but are still connected to it are in a real nice position to tell you something.
Yeah. So true. I mean, I'll tell you, where I live now, I lived here about 4 years ago for 2 years. And then I left and moved back to Boulder where I've lived off and on for 2 years before I came back. And that time in between, I actually recommend that people who have been here for some years, I recommend that they leave, because it's like you say, leaving a space like this just completely transforms your relationship with it, whether you come back or not. And it's just, you're right. That would be fascinating to gather a group of people who had spent significant time in community and have them reflect on what that was like. And Gurdjieffian communities are so cool too, so that'd be excellent.
Yeah, they're very. They have a lot of unusual ways of going at it, and I know enough of them that
they do.
I can see all the ways they disagree with each other.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know. I've only been to one.
One might think.
Oh, fascinating. Oh, cool.
Like some communities think that the fourth way is totally contaminated by Ouspensky's phrasing. I don't know if that means anything to you, but
interesting.
right? Other people are like,
well, a little bit. Yeah.
Just read Gurdjieff's books. Don't read any of the other stuff. And other people are like, start with our general understanding of the community. And there's a lot of back and forth.
Yeah. Beautiful. I mean, I love that diversity. I think, that's wonderful. Love that stuff.
All right, Daniel Thorson, what do you think we should talk about next?
I'll tell you, I'm really happy that we haven't talked about COVID. I'm really happy about that. Everybody wants to know what I think about COVID because I was in retreat while it happened. I have been just learning about it, and so I don't want this to be an opening to talk about it, but I want to appreciate you for not talking about it. I don't know. I mean, I guess I didn't really do a lot of research on this project before I stepped into this space. So I'm not sure what feels salient. I think I feel more curious about your perspective. I know that you've written for the Integral Review, and you had a couple, I think, articles in the Post Metaphysical Special Edition, which I know about from Tom Murray. And so there's a part of me that just wants to kind of fall down the post metaphysical spirituality rabbit hole, and in particular, like I have a personal interest in drawing connections between that way of looking and the approach that I mentioned before, the soul-making Dharma, because I see that as a kind of paradigmatic post-metaphysical spiritual praxis. And so I'm very curious about what symmetries exist there. But I also don't know that would make for very compelling media content. Yeah.
Well, anybody could stop listening at this point if they want to.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting stuff. I like to go into it, briefly and intensely and come back out. I don't like to dwell too long in that. Really, there's just some intense, beautiful Byzantine philosophical and logical approaches involved. At trying to figure out the relationship between whether things have the equivalent of an inherent essence, despite the fact that all our experience of them is relative and conditioned. How much, what can you take as a given, even given that you're approaching the world through the types of meditative, contemplative, and spiritual techniques that people have used throughout history, and they've used them in the context of assuming all these givens. That's an interesting question to me. But the thing I'm focused on most is, how do you describe the phenomenological validity and effectiveness of practice found in spiritual and religious traditions without making any assumptions about what exists?
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. How do you?
Well, my tendency is to think of it as an orchestration of functional subcomponents to produce a surplus resonance, which we can then interact with once we've produced it. And that's individually, that looks like a higher thing about us. Collectively, it looks like a higher thing about a community. And we can look at that extra thing through different lenses. We could look at it through a first-person lens and say, well, that's my higher or deeper experience of myself. We could look in a second-person lens and say it was as if it was a higher person or entity that I related to. We look at it objectively and say it was as if it was a higher energy or experience I was drawn into. We've got these options, but they all play off this thing that can be produced in our experience by certain kinds of practices. And I think it's plausible to find the through line in very diverse spiritual practices of combining our subjective systems by like heart, mind, and body, or the chakras, or left and right, or our perception of ourselves and our perception of the other, or our perception of consciousness and our perception of the world. Like, these are all subjectively active systems that we have within us. And most spiritual practices involve some enhanced coordination between these subjective systems to the point where it succeeds into a numinous extra that we then have to deal with.
Right, we didn't have to deal with it. Makes it seem so pleasant.
I mean, praise the Lord when He emerges.
Yeah, right. Then we get to deal with it. Yeah. Well,
don't let the gods hear me say that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, I love that. I mean, for me, I guess if we want to do a little bit of like, well, I guess I'll just say it. So that corresponds to my understanding in my world of one type of practice of like samadhi practice, right? Trying to harmonize all of the systems, as you say, and that. In the retreat I just did, I was practicing with the approach of jhanas, so that would produce a kind of like numinous experience of the jhanas, perhaps. Although in Buddhism, obviously, that's not understood as being transcendental. It's just a very refined material experience. But the way that I have resolved that problem, because I helped design the curriculum here at the Monastic Academy, and one of my curiosities is, how do we talk about what happens when you do these practices intensively without using the epistemologies of the dominant culture, like materialism or rendering it in terms of what the self gets or something like that. And typically the way that I talk about it is as that we're playing with perception. We're learning how perception works. That's it. That's actually all we're doing, is that we're learning how to participate with our perception in ways that either relieve suffering or amplify meaningfulness. And that's it. That's, and so you kind of, in that way, I find it's quite a simple way to not make any unnecessary claims, but still retain the potency, because it turns out the perception is empty and you can just play in that space. And it includes everything. It turns out that everything is perception. So it's a very inclusive way of presenting things too. How does that square with
I don't see any irresolvable problem between that and what I just said. It made me think of different approaches to perception and how they could be conceived of as coordinating these different parts. So for example, intentional attention exercises, where you're going to focus on purpose or sustain a purposeful focus, that allows a lot of parts to come together on the same project in the way that riding a bicycle involves many lateral things being drawn together in the forward motion. There's also a kind of, if I just wanted to perceive everything in an open way, in order to do that, I have to dial down things I'm privileging in my focus and kind of dial up things I'm not privileging, so that there's a kind of equilibrium, a parsimony between those things, right? But now they're in a position to be balanced together. I'm already perceiving them, but now I'm trying to perceive them with relatively equivalent focus, and that's where they can start to blend together to produce this slightly more than the sum of its parts thing that might come forward to me under those conditions of practice.
Yeah. Well, but I guess my question for you then is, again, play my biases, is that, what it's all about is about deeper and deeper realizations of emptiness, the empty nature of things, of perception. And it's not obvious to me how that fits into the way that you're constructing it. Is it so yes, you can harmonize different systems within your experience, but fundamentally liberation happens to the degree that you see all those systems and all those perceptions and all those, even the harmony itself and all that. So how does that square?
Well, let me take emptiness in at least three directions. On the one hand, there's the assertion of the ontological emptiness of things, right? Is that assertion justified or not? We don't know. Emptiness itself is empty of emptiness.
Yes, right.
And to some degree, emptiness, the cognitive idea of absence, might be problematic, right? There might be a nihilistic hint in some of that phrasing, depending on who you're talking to about. Secondarily, one way to think of emptiness is as an extra present quality which exceeds the objects of cognition. And that's a description of this numinous more than the sum of its parts, right? You've got all the things, then there's this other something, whether we call it emptiness or energy or presence or God or whatever. It's just not any of the things. And it allows those things to be full of themselves and also to be coordinated, but it also isn't limited by any of the combinations of those things. And then the third way I go at it is, in order to achieve higher coordination of the parts, you need more spaciousness, right? Same as if your muscles were all knotted up, your functional coordination is decreased. You've got to space them out. So when you see the atoms that make up the molecule, now there's another whole range of coordinations to consider. Everywhere you find this extra spaciousness, you've found the availability to an enhanced coordination that you hadn't considered before.
That's fun. I love that. Yeah. I mean, it would be, I feel like we have time to go all the way into this, but I would love to sit down with you sometime and just really explore. I feel like I have a desire to reconcile the system that I practice in with what you're saying. And it would be, it would be fun for me to do as a kind of game.
Sure. Yeah.
And but I don't know that I want to do that right now.
Yeah, and I would love that. Let's do that, because these are some of
Cool.
the most passionately interesting topics in my heart.
Yeah. One thing I will say, though, I'll be curious just on this one piece, is the first part that you said around whether or not emptiness can be considered a kind of ontological truth. From where I'm coming from, that matters less than whether or not adopting it as a provisional truth liberates. And that much I think that we can be quite confident in. And so that, again, is why I think it's of great benefit to ground everything in perception, because then ontology actually becomes enacted within the context of using different ways of seeing to interface with perception or to perceive differently. And emptiness then is just one method of experimentation that just happens to be really baller and good at resolving
the
suffering.
provisional hypothesis of emptiness has produced a great number of significant results over the millennia. I would probably tweak the description there a little bit and say that what's producing the results in my mind is the addition of the hypothesis of emptiness to the normal experience of the cognition of the universe. So that what you've got there are two systems at play, and you go back and forth between them, and that blending is another harmonization that produces this excess effect.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. And that's how you get a form in emptiness.
Yeah, you get a non-duality mode there.
Yeah. Huh. Fun. I'll have to sit with that.
Let's totally do that sometime.
Yeah, I would love that.
Let me know whenever's good.
Sure. Yeah, I'll reach out. I mean, this is something that I'm coming out of retreat really curious about, because my teacher here at the monastery is a Zen teacher, Soryu for all, but the teacher in my heart, like my root teacher in my heart, is Rob Burbea, and he just passed away 3 weeks ago. And he constructed this. I've interviewed him like 4 times on my podcast. I think I've interviewed him more than anybody else. And he has built, I believe, the most elegant and practical approach to deepening an understanding of emptiness. And I find it just endlessly beautiful. And one of the things I feel committed to is really kind of pushing that into more spaces and seeing how it rubs up against other ways of looking at these kinds of topics, and really sort of like fine-tuning my understanding, fine-tuning like the system, because he's no longer with us. So it has to, for me, I want it to be carried forward somehow, and I feel like I can help do that. So I would love to play with you and see what we can cover together. Let's get together and mutually fine-tune ourselves around the theme of emptiness. Yeah. Wow, I feel that was really exciting. Okay. All right, let me try to bring this back to podcasters and then segue out of here. Sure. I usually ask at the end, what would you ask the next person I talk to? Someone who's also involved in trying to bring interesting ideas and approaches through in an online format. What would you be curious about from their experience? Yeah. I'd be curious if they ever think about stopping, and if they do, why? And if they do and they keep going, why? Because I think about wrapping up my project pretty regularly. Yeah. That's nice. No one has suggested that yet, but I bet it's pertinent to the feelings of a lot of people doing this. I've got a radio show too. Every week I think, how much longer am I going to keep doing this? Haven't I said it already? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, this has been terrific. I'm loath to stop because I'm having a really nice time with you, but we've got the promise of this other
Yeah.
thing, so I can let it go. And an hour and a half is enough for anyone listening to listen to.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you, Layman. I've seen you online, and I'm really happy that we've had a chance to connect. And I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. I felt that it's been like, it's funny coming off retreat. I feel like I'm like booting up the conceptual territory of the conversational spaces that I've participated in, like over the last couple of years. Like I let go. I just forgot all about it while I was on retreat. Obviously, I wasn't thinking about this stuff. But this has been a really lovely way, I think, to kind of like bootload a little bit more of that. So thank you for helping me find this self again today. And yeah, look forward to more connection and conversation. Yeah.